Right there?
No, hold on. I think we fixed it. Brendan, can you hear us?
Yeah. Again?
Try again?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Brendan, can you hear us? Liz?
Evidently not.
Yeah, sure.
We had everything going through the speakers.
Looks like Shirley, Tom, Liz have all given the thumbs up. Don't know about Peter.
Liz, can you unmute yourself just so we can hear you to make sure that audio is coming through?
Everyone has to unmute themselves.
Could someone from the committee?
There, is
Hello?
that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Are you able to hear me now?
So Peter just spoke. We didn't hear him.
Yeah. Okay.
And are you able to hear Paul Allen?
Yes.
Just we turn those off.
So we did have everything going through the speakers.
Those don't. Hey.
All right.
There we go.
There we go. We can hear you now.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Special Heritage Advisory Committee meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 9:37 a.m.
Through the chair, could you say 1.1?
1.1, due to COVID-19, this meeting will be conducted as a virtual, physically distant meeting with no physical public attendance. Could I have a motion to confirm the agenda, please? Ernie to move, Don to second, all in favor, committee members? Yes, okay, thank you.
Through the chair, can you read the motion?
Yes, that the agenda for the Special Heritage Advisory Committee meeting of October 28, 2020 be confirmed. We have a mover, second, and all in favor. Okay, the disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. Are there any declarations today? No? Okay, thank you. We have received, number 4, we've received correspondence, which was part of a package that you received in preparation for this meeting. And then we now move to deputations. Let me just say a few things about the deputation to begin with. I ask that you address your comments and answers to any questions through the chair. Limit the presentation to 10 minutes maximum. There may be questions from members of the committee that follow. Please, at the outset, state your name for the information of those people who are viewing on Zoom, and ask you then, Paul, to go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My name is Paul Allen, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to speak about the report of the McDonald Working Group. Nearly 1 year ago, my partner and I attended a large gathering at St. Mary Magdalene Church to hear Dr. Egan Sinclair speak about the memorialization of Sir John A. Macdonald. Dr. Sinclair's presentation was the first in a series of talks being planned. The launch of the series coincided with the pending reinstallation of Holding Court on Main Street. It was suggested that the statue's return was a fait accompli. The contract with the MacDonald project reportedly left the county with no alternative. The series of talks seemed intended to help residents reconcile themselves to this generally accepted truth. I'd heard of some of the controversies surrounding statues of MacDonald and other figures who'd played major roles in a shameful part of our nation's history. That evening, I learned a lot more about how communities across Canada were struggling with what to do with their painted monuments. I was struck by Dr. Sinclair's answer to one question from the audience in particular. He was asked, "If it were up to you, what would you have done with the monument in Picton?" He answered, "As a newcomer and as an Indigenous person, I would ask, how do Indigenous peoples in this territory feel about you putting up a monument to John A. Macdonald? If your answer is, we don't know, then you need to start there." I thought we should also be asking, how do non-Indigenous people feel about the statue? And so 5 of us addressed council a few weeks later and asked that the reinstallation of holding court be deferred until the public had been given a chance to share their thoughts about the statue. The county instead reinstalled holding court unceremoniously on Main Street less than a month later. That day, however, the mayor did promise to seek public feedback on the statue early in the new year. Public consultation about holding court became a priority for the county only with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests in June and July, including calls for the removal of statues of Confederate traders in America, slave traders in Europe, and MacDonald in Canada. Which brings us to today's meeting. The working group, with the able assistance of municipal staff, has delivered on the mayor's promise. While the process has been imperfect, it's a legitimate start to what advocates on all sides of the controversy agree is a long overdue and inevitably difficult conversation in our community. In my long career in children's mental health, I've witnessed the devastation of intergenerational trauma among members of many Indigenous families. I did my best to help with life-threatening crises in communities across Ontario, in Manitoba, Labrador, and Nunavut. I've consulted to programs in Saskatchewan that do similar work. And the Chief Coroner of Ontario has asked one of my closest colleagues to help investigate the recent death of multiple Indigenous children and youth in the residential care of children's aid societies. Though I've been retired for about 2 years, what I witness in my work still haunts me. So when I consider Macdonald, his legacy is very much present and pressing in the lives of today's Indigenous people. And his acts of genocide against their ancestors will forever be a source of deep shame for Canadians. I have no specific comments on the working group's final report, but I would like to highlight a few passages from 2 deputations. First, Dr. Sean Carlton is a professor in the departments of History and Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. He was the only professional historian to address the working group. I urge you to rely upon Dr. Carlton's clear distinction between statues and history. He remarked, quote, "We hear you can't remove a statue because it's erasing history. As an historian, I can tell you very confidently that statues are not history. They are commemorations. They are celebrations of particular values that people want to enshrine and embody and project in public spaces to future generations. They're supposed to be people that we are to look up to. People will say, you can't take away the statue. That's politically motivated. we need to remember that the creation of monuments and statues and commemorations and their defenses are also political, unquote. Dr. Carleton ended his deputation with a plea that Canadians recognize that this is not the time to be celebrating men like MacDonald with statues like holding court. He stressed, quote, "The major project defining Canada right now is truth and reconciliation, of trying to find ways for Canadians and Indigenous people to reconcile their relations, to build a better future together moving forward. Unfortunately, while Canadians understand MacDonald as a nation builder, Indigenous people understand him as a nation destroyer. Having uncritical statues of people like MacDonald, and there are others that were in favor of these policies, are perhaps not the best symbols today. As historians, that's okay. We can make different decisions about who we celebrate and what are the kinds of values we want to inspire new generations to uphold. An architect of genocide is perhaps not the most suitable person in these times to be uncritically celebrating in our public spaces," unquote. Finally, I want to say a few words about the deputation of Sarah Crawford and Sarah Moran, the co-vice chairs of the Prince Edward County Arts Council. As a leading not-for-profit service organization representing 250 plus members in the art sector overall in the county, the Arts Council advised a working group that the main purpose of the statue is not education, nor is the statue necessarily the best educational tool. Instead, statues in the likeness of a person are created and displayed in ways specifically selected to celebrate that person. This was certainly the MacDonald Project's intention in the case of holding court. In the Q&A segment of her appearance, Ms. Crawford posed several questions to residents of the county. Quote, "Is this the person that we want to have standing in our community? Not as an educational piece, but as a celebration. What does that mean? What does he represent? Does it cause the community to come together in a unified voice and say, yes, this is a wonderful thing? Or does it cause some members of the community to feel pain because they feel by implication excluded or much worse? We have to all ask ourselves what, in the lens of today's findings from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in understanding the true history of Canada, what does this statue mean to our community? Do we want to keep it in public view on public land? How should we move forward?" Unquote. The MacDonald Working Group has responded clearly and decisively to Dr. Carleton's plea and Ms. Crawford's questions. The county should remove holding court to storage for later consideration. I am hopeful that the Heritage Advisory Committee will embrace the recommendation of its MacDonald Working Group and will urge Council to do the same. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Paul. And now open it to members of the advisory committee for any questions. And we don't have any here, or let me just check our Zoom members. I'll just ask again for those on Zoom. Are there anybody have questions for Paul? No. Okay. Good. Thank you. Then can I have a motion, the deputation by Paul Allen regarding the holding court John A. MacDonald statue be received? Shirley to move. Second. Ernie to second. All in favor, please. Yes, and that's carried. Thank you very much. Item 6, comments from the audience. We have received no items for this part of the agenda. So we'll move to item 7, which is a report of the recommendation of the Holding Court Working Group. Let me just set some context for the discussion to come. As chair of the working group and also chair of the Heritage Advisory Committee, let me just make a few comments on the context. The working group began meeting on August 4th and with the goal of advising the Heritage Committee in their recommendation to Council on the current installation of the John A. Macdonald Holding Court statue. After 9 meetings, 12 deputations, hundreds of comments submitted to the Have Your Say platform, and more than 120 emails, the working group has provided its advice to the Heritage Committee. The group's advice has the weight of public consultation and discussion within the committee. Today, the committee will receive and consider that advice and vote to make a recommendation to Council. And at a special meeting on November the 17th, Council will decide on the future of the statute. With that, I'd like to open to the committee members' discussion and questions they may have. Let me ask, please, that before you talk, as you turn on your microphone, please state your name so that people at home or elsewhere on Zoom know who's making the comments. Okay? Open to discussion among the committee members. Don?
Try to look at your other way.
Over your side, John. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for the home. My name is Don Payne. I'm a member of Pehac for those on Zoom. We're living in emotional times, and many people are looking at the past and they're not liking what they see. Groups in the U.S. are remembering the treatment of African Americans, remembering slavery, and remembering the Civil War. They want to destroy a lot of the public symbols of those who they feel are responsible for these things, or who participated by owning slaves and the like. Other communities, such as our neighbors down the road in Kingston, have dealt with this same issue that we are now facing. The exercise is a good one, and in the end, we'll all be better for it. However, we must try to examine things rationally and without the vitriol that often starts these discussions, and sometimes take them on a course that would be benefited from a good dose of sober second thought. I want to give you my thoughts in 3 chapters. I title them Carnegie, Education, and Public Opinion. And I want to preface these by saying that as I reread this material this morning, I was struck by the lack of appreciation in my remarks about the depth of feeling that a lot of people experience as they're going by a statue on Main Street. I don't mean to diminish or minimize the pain that they're feeling, and I'm sorry that it didn't get picked up more in my written remarks, but I hope that you'll take that as a bit of an overriding condition on all what I've got to say. But Chapter 1, Carnegie. It's ironic that Holding Court is currently located in front of the Picton Library, because the Picton Library is a Carnegie library. It's one of over 2,500 libraries across the US, Canada, and Britain that were built with financial assistance from Andrew Carnegie. He also founded what is now Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and financed the construction of Carnegie Hall in New York City. He gave away over $350 million before he died in 1919. Apparently that would be over $6 billion in today's dollars, and it's American dollars at that. Carnegie was a very wealthy man, and he used his riches to support a great many public initiatives before he passed away. However, Carnegie's history was not all sweetness and light. He paid the workers in his steel mills barely above the poverty level, and although he said publicly that he supported trade unions, his actions said otherwise. When they sought higher wages, he shut down the mills and would only allow non-union workers to come in to work. The union went on strike and protest, and Carnegie used Pinkerton armed guards to escort strikebreakers into the plant. He held out until the union workers just ran out of money, and then he allowed them back in only if they left the union. Carnegie's steel mills were also incredible polluters, constantly belching thick black smoke into the air from tons of coal they burned in the steelmaking process. He also owned the coal mines, where workers died from black lung disease contracted from working deep underground in the mines of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Like Sir John A., Carnegie did many wonderful things, but he also did some things that we regard today as despicable. He became one of the world's richest men by forcing his employees to work for a paltry wage and kick them out into the street if they dared to ask for more. His companies were tremendous polluters, and in addition to the damage to the environment and the atmosphere, this cost thousands of lives. Can you imagine the clamor if Carnegie was allowed to run his business in this way today? Given what we know about pollution, given our more enlightened labor regulations, this would never be allowed. But in Carnegie's time, almost all the big industries were operated this way. Carnegie Steel was not unique, nor were the coal mines. He operated in the accepted manner of the day. Today, we judge him harshly by today's standards, but those standards were not known back then. We can disapprove, but it's not realistic to expect him to have run his empire according to the standards that wouldn't come into play for decades. So we gladly accept Carnegie's contributions because they made a positive impact in our society. He also acted in a manner that we reject today, but this is a very different time from the 1800s. We're not about to tear down all of the Carnegie libraries, 115 of which are in Ontario, or Carnegie Hall, or Carnegie Mellon University, or many of the other buildings that he supported. We can appreciate all the good he's done, and we can still acknowledge the negative aspects of his history. We could also look at William Lyon Mackenzie, who was in charge in Ottawa during the Second World War, when people of Japanese descent, some of whom were Canadian citizens, were interned for the balance of the war just for being Japanese. Or Wilfrid Laurier for his part in increasing the head tax on Chinese immigrants in the early 1900s. As one of the email messages to the working group said, it would be difficult to find anyone from that time who lived up to all of the standards we have today. It's as ridiculous to judge people from over a century ago by today's standards as it would be to judge people from back then, people today, by the standards from back then. Think of where the LGBTQ community would be, how they'd be treated. Think of the role of women in society and government. Think of legalizing marijuana. Think of the use of profanity. Very different standards today than from back then. Times were different, standards were different, people were different.
That's right.
Chapter 2, Education. When this issue first came to light following Mr. St. Clair's lecture, it prompted me, and I suspect many others in the county, to look into Sir John A.'s background. I read a number of articles on his history, his accomplishments, his failures. I particularly focused on the period during which he was involved in legislation that related to the country's Indigenous people. It was interesting reading, and while I am far from understanding all of the complexity of the issue, I did learn a few things that are relevant to the man and his times. For example, I learned that he supported legislation that was very harmful and very discriminatory to the Indigenous population, but that the opposition party, the Liberals at the time, criticized him and his Tory colleagues for not being harsh enough. I also learned that the Indian Act, which was at the heart of so much of the criticism of Macdonald, was actually passed in 1876 by the Liberal government, led by Alexander Mackenzie. Macdonald returned to power in 1878, and his government started the residential school program. I had not known much of this before the discussions about holding court drew me to the topic. I was being educated. It's never too late. When I was reviewing the email messages from the public, I noticed that there were several from students at Prince Edward Collegiate. It was obvious that a history class had discussed holding court. I thought, what a tremendous opportunity for those young people to talk about a local live event that combined their community's history with the story of the country's first prime minister and that of the nation's Indigenous people. On top of that, they could offer their individual input to those who were dealing with the issue. If the holding court statue had not been prominent in downtown Picton, this issue would probably not have become the focus of discussion in the community, and I, as well as others, such as the students at PECI, would not have learned about MacDonald, the terrible early treatment of Indigenous people by our government, or the many positive things that MacDonald accomplished. The holding court statue is a teachable moment in our midst. Thirdly, chapter 3 is the last one, public opinion. It's important that the recommendation by Pehac and the decision by council are reflective of public opinion on this issue. Although the terms of reference of the working group suggest conducting research and carrying out surveys, it does not appear that there was any organized effort to assess public opinion. There were opportunities for members of the public to offer their thoughts through emails, letters, deputations, or by contacting the county's Have Your Say portal. But there was not a survey in which a sample of the public was systematically selected and asked for their views. In the absence of that, we at least have the emails that were sent in, the messages to Have Your Say, and the poll conducted by Quinte News. None of these are scientific controlled surveys, but they're the best we have. There were 137 email messages attached to the agenda for today's meeting, and staff provided me with 83 messages left at Have Your Say. For the purpose of this exercise, I combined the two and did my best to categorize them under the following headings. First, keep the statute where it is and as it is, the status quo, if you will. Second, keep the statute but with alterations to either its location, its support information, etc. Status quo light. 3, remove the statute. And 4, other input but no stated opinion which really regards the future of the statute. Now, one could very legitimately argue with my placement of individual messages in one category or the other, but in the vast majority of the messages, it was very clear what the writer's position was. The results of my classification of the 220 messages are as follows, and I'll give you percentages rather than the raw numbers. Keep the statute where it is, status quo, 37.3%. Keep the statute with alterations to its location, support info, etc., 21.8%. Remove the statute, 28.6%. Other, 12.3%. Now, if you combine the first two options, status quo and status quo light, you'll see that 59.1% of the responses support retention in some form, more than twice as many as supported removal. In short, the numbers really do not support the removal option. The other source of public input that I mentioned was the Quinte News survey. I wasn't able to find out how the question was asked or how many people responded, but the results were similar to those of the emails, etc. On October 24th, Quinte News reported the following results of their poll. Statute should stay, 66%. Removal, 29%. Indifferent, 5%. I thought the indifferent number might have been higher. In summary, I do not support the removal of the statute holding court as recommended by the working group. That action, I feel, would unfairly target MacDonald, his warts and all, for being a man of his time. It would also rob our community of a great teachable moment, and from the limited data we have, it would appear to be in conflict with the wishes of the community. Instead, I support the retention of the statute in its current location, but with enhanced signage to provide viewers with more complete and balanced information on MacDonald's background. And in closing, I'd like to include a paragraph from one of the emails submitted by a member of the public. I quote, MacDonald and his government did promote policies that are now generally taken to be unacceptable and discriminatory. These must not be overlooked or concealed, but must be included in the total picture of the man and his actions. Historians must ensure that the stories of our past are complete and are accurate. We are intelligent enough to weigh and judge based on the complete history, but any efforts to diminish the complete history must not be accepted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Don. Open it up to other members of the advisory committee for comments or questions. Liz.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I really appreciate the work and the effort of the working group. I value, I think that, we had 2 Pehac members, John Hirsch and Brendan O'Connor, plus the chair, Ken Dewar, participating in the working group. And that is a very important thing that we have to recognize. So in this meeting that we're having, what I hope we can have is like just a discussion to learn from you, our Pehac members there in the working group, to make sure we can have a proper discussion, pull out all of the questions, tease out the issues. I personally am not sure that we can come to a recommendation to council today, but let's give it a go. So I do have several questions, but I'd just like to pose 1 or 2 and then maybe dive back in with more questions. Ken, if that's okay, like I have to assume that we're not just limited to one expression in this meeting. Can you confirm that?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, that's great. Because I think from the very beginning, I remember making the point that I felt that this whole discussion, everything needs to be open to the public. Everyone has to hear it, and we are all active participants, every single person, whatever their view. So my first question to our Pehac members on the working group is why was there no quantitative and qualitative assessment of the public response in the report? And I would like to just say that for the Picton terminals, the CAO, I believe, took the public input and created a template. So identified every person who provided input, categorized their views, added it up, and I listened to the council discussion about Picton terminals, and I remember that one of the council members turned to that template and said, okay, this is not the only information. Like, it's not just about a vote, okay? It's not just about numbers, but those numbers do help to tell the story. So my question is, why in the report is there no assessment in numbers of the public response, or a Marshall, like trying to synthesize and kind of put forward the viewpoints? Because it seems that we're just relying on a secret ballot of 7 people. So my question is about qualitative and quantitative.
Yeah, I should mention we have 3 members of staff here, but 2 members who work closely with the working group as well, and who are also able and to contribute. So, would you like to say something, Emily?
Sure. This is Emily Cowan. Myself and my colleague Noah Lister-Stevens were staff support on the Holding Court Working Group. When the working group first got together, one of the first things that they discussed was how to conduct public consultation. I think it was discussed briefly and early on that a survey could be issued by the municipality without any input or research of any kind, and that the idea of a working group is that there is discussion, more deep public consultation, especially because part of the mandate was to adhere to the Truth and Reconciliation 10 principles. So it was the decision of the working group fairly early on that it was more than a survey. It was a working group looking to discuss the issue in detail, ask for suggestions from the public as to what they think should be done with the holding court statute, as that was the question that the working group was left with. Does that help?
Liz, do you want to follow up?
Well, it doesn't actually answer the question. I was listening to I actually zoomed in on the working group committee meeting where staff presented, took the public input and identified the themes and stated that they weren't going to give the numbers. But what I don't understand is, why do the votes of 7 people count? So the thing is, the report relies, and the report states that it relies on the outcome of the vote. So it is relying on the outcome of the 7 people who put their votes in. If it is about truth and reconciliation, why is there, but there's the numbers and then there's the qualitative. Why is there no effort of the working group to present their conversations, and where did they come to in assessing the input from the community? All we're left with is a secret ballot of 7 votes. We don't even know, although we might be able to presume who voted how. I just don't see in the report an effort at reconciling the views. And in fact, there's no statement. There's no statement in the report that says, this actually comes to my second question, and let's just throw this all out because I think that these issues are all interconnected. And I actually would prefer not to have an answer from staff. I prefaced my original question about qualitative and quantitative to our Pehac members, because Pehac is a heritage advisory group. Heritage is definitely not about numbers, actually. Heritage is about looking at all the different strands and values and coming up with recommendations and assessments of things, and putting ideas together in a way which responds to the community and expresses things to the community and leads to the community. And so that's why I think I would really, at this meeting, like to hear from our Pehac reps why you didn't synthesize the public arguments, which we normally do in Pehac, and also why you relied on a secret ballot. That I do not understand.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Liz, this is John Hirsch. I'm a Pehac member on the working group. Liz, this kind of leads into what I was going to say anyway, because I thought it would be useful for this committee to understand perceptions of members of the working group on how the working group functioned, which was not entirely well. And so I'll preface my remark by saying that I don't think that we as Pehac need to necessarily simply rubber stamp the recommendation made by the working group, because there were flaws in that process, and you've kind of identified some of that. What I found was that, unfortunately, and despite parameters kind of laid out by the chair at the beginning of the working group sessions, a number of members of the working group on both sides of the issue nevertheless went public to the print media, to social media, promoting their very strong views on either side of the issue. which certainly leads me to believe that those folks really weren't taking a dispassionate view of the issue. And so we're kind of committed in advance, even before we got going, to their position. Whenever I was speaking and asking questions of deputants, and as we went through our discussions, I tried to make the point that we needed to have a discussion about the decision-making process itself, regardless of it being Sir John A. or Ulysses Grant or Washington or whoever, it doesn't matter. How does one go about making a decision in these times of what to do with statues, or in this case, a work of art which memorializes, commemorates individuals who have perhaps mixed history. But all attempts at that discussion quickly devolved on the working group into dissertations from either side about history. And it ended up, I'm sorry to say, too simply perhaps, as a scoring game. You know, was he 60% bad and 40% good? Or was he 60% good and 40% bad? Pick your numbers. That's kind of what it came down to. We never really were able to get the working group to discuss the process of how to make the decision. And I think when I look at the work that Kingston did, they did perhaps a better job of that. So the other thing I think we failed to take account of was that very early in the session, in fact, our very first meeting, Chief Miracle from the Mohawks attended and gave a rather lengthy talk. And he talked a lot about reconciliation, and he talked about not erasing history and accepting the fact that history exists and is to be perhaps added to rather than taken away from. And yet we never got anything later on, directly from the chief or from the representatives from the Mohawks on what their position was. And I really wish we had a chance to hear that. So since we didn't really have the opportunity to talk about process, I did a little research myself, and there's recent work on this because the issue has become so large, especially in North America. So there's a professor at Yale named Stephen Carter who wrote in Bloomberg recently about how to make decisions on whether or not to take down statues. And he says there's really two rules. First rule is no statue is entitled to exist merely because it exists now. That's pretty simple. Just because it's there doesn't mean it gets to stay. Rule number two, he said, and this is the one that matters most, is that much of the social media debate, he says, has been over whether a historical figure who took a morally objectionable position must be understood as a man of his time. And we hear that a lot, right? The response of activists has often been along the lines of, well, Hitler was a man of his time too. Both sides are mistaken in this case. Hitler was not a man of his time. The most devastating war in human history was fought to prove otherwise. On the other hand, we shouldn't excuse anyone just because of the times in which he lived. The right question, says Professor Carter, is where he stood with respect to the moral understandings of his time. And I think we know, and Don Payne covered this fairly well, where MacDonald stood in relation to the moral understandings of his time. The Globe and Mail, just a few weeks ago, also did an editorial. This is the editorial board of the Globe. And they point on this very same issue, pointing out that no good can come from whitewashing history or burying wrongs done. MacDonald, flawed as he was, laid the foundation for something that is fundamental in our lives, namely this country itself. And they concluded their opinion piece by saying, on the whole, it seems wiser to add to Canadian history than to get into arguments over how to subtract from it. That doesn't mean we can't ever take down a statue or change the name of a building, but adding to history is always possible because Canada never stops growing. It never stops offering opportunities for new monuments, new symbols, new names, without necessarily having to bury the old. And that's kind of where I come down on this. And Liz, I remain, disappointed that we weren't able to have the process discussion on the working group, because it ended up being statements hard and fast of positions regarding who this man was, as opposed to, in fact, what the work of art is. And one of our deputants said it very well. Henri Garin put forward a very good deputation, pointing out that this is a conversation piece. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm looking, Brendan. Yes, thank you, Brendan. I think your mic is off.
Hi, I'm Brendan O'Connor. I'm on Pehac, and I was also on the working group. And I guess to Liz and Don, just a couple important things. One, it wasn't perfect, but I think it's important to note that this wasn't an exercise of majority rule. This was an exercise of really reaching out to the community and getting all viewpoints. And what became clear is that, a couple themes emerged. One of them being, we need to have a conversation, a community conversation about how do we deal with our public spaces? What do we want them to look like? How do we memorialize figures of history? This is something that it came up as the wording for it was a public art policy, which could encompass a lot of things. And so I think it's important to note, like, the decision that the working group made wasn't just the end all and be all. It was more of, from what I gathered and got, was more of a statement of saying, look, this statue creates trauma for certain groups of people. And that's important that we understand that, and that it's noted, and that we need to take this statue away for now in order to have this bigger public conversation. And so, we get caught up, a lot of people got caught up in the history and what this meant, and feeling like they were being, their interpretation of history was being slighted. But for me, it was really important to note, look, this does cause trauma to people. And we need to have this greater conversation. And so, that conversation within the working group wasn't perfect, but it was certainly a starting point. And so I think that Pehac needs to take that into consideration, and take this really as a starting point. People don't need to panic thinking that, this is how that we're going to deal with our historical figures. This is how we're going to deal with statues. It's more, this is a starting point of a greater conversation. And I think that's really what I got out of it.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. I'm just trying to see whether there's anybody else sorry, Liz, I just want to see if there's anybody else who doesn't seem to be. Okay, Liz?
Sure. It should, as I said, it shouldn't be a numbers game. But at the same time, I just have to go back to the report, because I don't think that it was a ranked ballot. It was a secret ranked ballot, and the thing about the report is it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain. Let me put it this way: it does not interpret the nuances of the result or the categories, and I think that there are lots of problems in the categories, so that what you get is a kind of a skewed result. Because if I just go back to, let me just find my comments here. So the categories, some of the categories overlap. So as is, modifying, which is adding plaques or perhaps another statue, those and even relocate somewhere else means keeping the statue but just adjusting its location within Picton. Those those three choices are actually, in a sense, one choice, one direction. The choice to remove is a whole other direction. And obviously, these are the two directions that need to be, that are kind of at butting heads with each other. So when you take the 7 voting members and you ask them to vote on the choices, you're splitting up the votes for the people who think that the statue might remain in some form, either as is, modified, or relocated, with those who would like it removed completely. So I think that there are even issues with the ballot questions, because as we all know, the question you ask and how you ask it affects the outcome. And so even if, and I do respect the process that the working group went through, I just don't think it finished the process, as John kind of points to, not like being clear about the process at the beginning and then kind of getting caught up a bit. But I think also that that the committee members, the working group, went through this long process, and here we are in one day, in this one meeting, supposed to synthesize all the public comments. Well, to give, really what's our purpose? To give some guidance to council to make the decision. And I think if there's anything that would come out of today, it's that do not rely on a secret ballot of 7 people with questions, with choices which are not clear. So I have another question for the committee, the Pehac members on the working group. Did all of you, did anybody on the working group get a chance to read the report before it was published? Or was it just a staff report and you sort of handed it over to staff to do? Who reviewed the report?
Hi, Liz, it's Emily Cowan, staff member. The report is really basically an accounting of what occurred during the working group. It basically is a recording of the process that the working group went through, the decisions that they made along the way, included a public consultation that was undertaken, and then reported the outcome of the final outcome of the working group. So really, the report is to be a correct account of what took place, and the chair did have a look at it before it was finally approved by the CAO and included in the agenda.
I have a follow-up question.
Okay, go ahead, Liz.
So my follow-up question to our Pehac reps is, do you think that this process is too time challenged? In other words, everybody was moving towards a November council date to bring the recommendation to council. And originally we were supposed to have a September 1st solution. Obviously that wasn't enough. I mean, do you think that the time challenge also affected how the dynamics of the working group, but also the problem or the challenge we're facing today?
John or Brendan, do you want to weigh in?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good question, Liz. I would say that time was and remains a challenge because, the schedule was set up, even though it was extended, it's still tight. And yes, more time would have allowed for more of the kind of discussion that you have talked about. I think, however, though, as I mentioned before, I think the makeup of the working group is such that more time wouldn't result in a better conclusion. I think that conclusion or furthering that conclusion remains with us and then ultimately with council. I think the working group went as far as it could. We have all of the information that the working group had before it. We have the options that were put forward, and as you said earlier, one can define those options a little differently, or think about them differently. But I'm not sure that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that more time would not have helped the working group come to any kind of a different solution.
Brendan, do you want to contribute anything?
Sure. Yeah, and just something else. I think the working group was also kind of a good cross section of the arguments that we were hearing, and so I don't think we need to look at that as a negative. I think that is the reality of what our community, the voices of our community, and so at the end of the day, I think really there was no, there was a lot of material, and I guess, Liz, I don't know if you've gone through everything that the working group listened to and read and heard. And so if you disagree, I mean, ultimately what this comes down to is, do you either agree or disagree with the recommendation? And because, that's really what's important. I think we have to send something to council, because ultimately it's going to be council's decision. Council is going to get all this material as well. And so, we had to set sort of a framework to work within, and that included time. But again, I go back to, this is really just the start, I think, of a bigger conversation that the community needs to have. And it's going to start with what council decides and what to do with the statute.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Ernie, you want this to speak?
Thank you, Ken. I don't have a long written out speech, Don, but I've been thinking about this a long time, and a number of people called me about it, and I appreciate that some of the sentiments and expressions like whitewash history, and we have to add to history, and this is a teachable moment, and I respect all of those things as far as the debate here. And when that statue was put there, and it commemorates Sir John A. Macdonald's time in Picton and what he did at the courthouse, it's still there. I appreciated that, because as a person of Prince Edward County, I appreciate our sense of place and the history before us, that came before us. So, and I still thought perhaps that as we go forward, we could use that in the way that has been expressed, perhaps adding context to the statue, but as I've gone further into it, I realized for myself, first, this is personal now, but the reconciliation process has to, acknowledge the past harm done. And I just think even the survey of people, like the 50% that Don said to keep it and alter it, even if there's one person, a year that comes down that street and feels the harm of that statue, that's too much for me. So I think as an inclusive and equitable society that we claim to be, I think that I would support the working group in the removal of the statue at this time. I think there are people in our community of Prince Edward County who are of Indigenous identity and descent, and their ancestors were directly negatively affected through policies and practices that are associated with Sir John A. Macdonald. And I feel that intergenerational trauma still exists today, and these Indigenous people are still healing from that trauma. And so those people, and it may be very few, but there's enough for me to feel empathy, that if that individual who perpetuated a portion of that demise of their people and inflicted that trauma, that to leave that there would not be supported by myself. So despite his accomplishments, and I know there's plenty of discussion, and I read it. There's all the positive things that he did and his mark in history. I just come down to there is the trauma that people feel and the pain, and I can't accept that. So I will support what the working group has recommended.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Are there any other members of the committee who want to contribute here? Let's see. Peter, yes. I thought that was your hand. Okay, go ahead.
It was my hand, yeah. Well, let me say that I think that this was an extraordinarily difficult challenge that was faced by the members of Pehac and the other members of the working group. This is an old, long-standing conversation that we do have to have, and we're in the early stages of it. So it's very raw, it's very emotional, it's very painful to go through this. When I made my deputation, I tried to put forward some substantive changes that we could do as a community, some possibilities. I've always viewed this as the question is, what do we do with our history that we have? In a way, we've inherited circumstances just like John A. and everybody that's gone before us. We've got this history. We didn't create this history. But the question is, what do we do with it? How do we come to a different place on it? I think we use the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's obviously an exhaustive study, 6 years, 6,000 people interviewed, over 90 recommendations. I support that work. I can't find in my reading of it where it actually says take away statutes or change street names. And I think that was very wise counsel, because when we do that, we divide ourselves rather than uniting ourselves about the process that we have to undergo today. So I would just point out, I may be mistaken, perhaps I'm not being able to find that recommendation, but if we're looking at base documents, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission doesn't recommend, in my reading of it, to take down street names and school names and statutes. And I think that was wisely and deliberately put there so that we don't get sidetracked about this is my history, you're taking it away, and all the emotional aspects of it. It recommended a whole bunch of other things. It actually recommended putting up more statutes, but they would be statutes that would contribute to history, broaden the history that we have, recognize the contributions of not just Indigenous people, but other cultures that have participated in the story of Canada. So in fact, in 2015, the city of Windsor put up a statue to Tecumseh. And I think we would all say, well, that's really great. Because without Tecumseh and his forces and also Brock, we might have lost the War of 1812. And the country would certainly be in American hands. So I really support, rather than taking away, I support adding to. And in my deposition, I tried to put together some things that we could do, which I thought were big, bold steps. Often this comes down to, well, what are we going to do? And what are practical steps that community can undertake with their history? So I was suggesting some things that, Indigenous Peoples Month is coming up next June. There's a real opportunity there to reach out to our Mohawk neighbors and co-host a whole bunch of events that foster understanding and coming over the two solitudes that we live in. I was suggesting that we follow up on Councillor Roberts' suggestion about assisting the Mohawks in repatriating Forester's Island to them as part of their traditional lands, and trying to do that. That is something that is not just symbolic, it's deeply meaningful to the Mohawks as they reclaim land that's been lost to them over the years. And the irony in that one is that the donor, the major owner of the land, the Independent Order of Foresters, has a long association with the Mohawks, and they've been trying for at least 15 years to try to give the land back. So there was that. There was also moving the gunshot treaty at Caring Place from its current location at the stoplights there, which is just a terrible location for history. Just you'd be taking your life in your hands to go and see the place. Even Parks Canada agrees with my assessment that it's in a terrible spot. They're just not willing to move it just at this point. But I think they would if there was a bit of pressure from us as a community to say, why don't you move it to nearby Murray Canal, where they have parking and interpretive services and other facilities that make it more amenable and accessible to the public to learn more about this important history, because it's really important history. It's not great history. It's not good. It's kind of ugly too, but it's significant history that's within the county that set the tone for First Nation relationship with white settlement. So it's important history. So I also propose that we investigate putting another piece of artwork in consultation with First Nations and created by First Nations artists right beside the MacDonald statue. And perhaps down the road we do something about French history as well. I would be very proud of us if we said we had this difficult conversation. It's really painful and very emotional. And the solution we came forward was to not take away history, but add to history, and to have these different contributions to Canada from Indigenous people, from people like MacDonald, and from the French contribution to the history that we have. And they were all as art pieces on our main street. I would be really proud that we came to that place. So, John, you asked me a question, the only question I got when I made my deputation. But you asked, we've got all this information and all these deputations and all these things are happening. What do we do with it? How would you distill it down into some sort of recommendation? And I suggested that I think the number one voice has to be First Nations. And I would be quite content if First Nations advised us, well, take it away because it's insulting. I can, even as someone on the MacDonald project, I would say it was never meant to be that way. But if that's how you feel, then I can live with that and let's take it away. I just don't think they're saying that. I don't think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that. Chief Miracle has been consistent on these issues about whether it's the renaming of a school in Belleville, Sir John A. School in Belleville, or the vandalism against the MacDonald statue in Montreal. He's been very consistent. He issued a statement about the vandalism in Montreal, and it was basically, don't delete history, add to it, do a better job of telling the whole story of this country. That is shared by David Chartrand, who's head of the Manitoba Métis. They had a similar conversation in their community about General Wolseley, who's the man MacDonald sent out there to quell the Riel Rebellion in 1870. So there was a petition to remove all mention of General Wolseley, and Mr. Chartrand of the Métis Federation said, no, we're not going to sign that petition. We want you to keep these memorials up so we always remember. So I guess the difficulty is I really support what First Nations feel and think and their guidance about it, and all my experience with them over my many years of working with them, doing media training for First Nations communication societies, working at Indian Affairs. I just know that they'll always give something careful consideration. So that is my lead choice, my lead priority in coming to a different place. And I think we got so many voices talking that, in fact, we're not hearing each other. We weren't hearing what First Nations are saying and not looking into those kinds of gray zones where there's compromise and creative solutions. So I agree with Brendan that this is a starting conversation in our community. I think we need to find things that unite us rather than divide us, things that are constructive rather than destructive, and look for a path forward. So I would just say that. I think we have to be clear about what Indigenous people are saying. And it may not be universal all the time, but I would say that I would go back into this and try to figure that out from what you heard and from places where we can go, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for some guidance on that. I would like to suggest that we look at this as well internally at Pehac and with staff and start to say, what are the lessons learned? Because, I mean, you can just see right from the beginning how polarized the discussions were. And John, you've been very candid about the difficulties you had in trying to focus this. You mentioned the Kingston experience, and perhaps in looking back, it might have been so much better to start off to say we'll be realistic about the time frame that we need to work with. And two, we would hire a professional First Nations consulting firm to act as facilitators in the process. I just think that Kingston's process was interesting, and they did manage to come to a place where they're keeping their work, but they're doing a whole bunch of imaginative things that I think are bringing about profound systemic change, which is what we have to have. We really have to move from an axiom of it's win or lose. Like I win and you lose. I think we have to make the argument under a new paradigm, which is we all win. So those are just my thoughts on it, that we really need to be certain what First Nations are saying, and we need to review the process and perhaps realize it's without professional skill sets as a facilitation firm, as they used in Kingston, and without a longer process, we're kind of stuck where we are today. But I want to thank you for your work. I just know how difficult it was.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Don?
Sorry, as I see you there, I'll get back to you in a second.
I'll be quick, Liz. I just want to respond to Ernie. And Ernie, I appreciate what you've said. You've given this a lot of thought, obviously, and you've got the feelings of a lot of people at heart when you say that. And I'm not disagreeing with you one iota in what I'm about to say. I have two things. One is that Chief Miracle, from his remarks, I'm sure he shares that sentiment that you put forward, but he's not suggesting that removal of the statue is a way to fix that situation. The feelings of people who are dealing with the aftermath of decisions back then and some today, those feelings are going to stay whether there's a statue there or not. Now, you can very rightly say that, well, the statue brings them to the surface, and that makes it more hurtful, and I don't disagree with that. The other thing that struck me is that there are people who are, view themselves maybe as great patriots and believers in many of the good things that MacDonald did, who will be offended by removing the statue. And I don't think I place their pain at the level that the pain of the people that you're talking about experience. But it's not as if removal isn't going to piss some people off too. And no matter which way you do it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Don. Liz?
Well, I'm going to just tie in with what Don said, because I noted that at the end of the staff report, as always, there's an assessment of risks. And the risk says, I'm putting the legal stuff aside, that's just a technical matter. Removal of the statue will likely prove unpopular with some residents. Now, the risk isn't whether the removal will be popular or unpopular. It's a much more serious risk than that. The risk arises from not having a process and a decision that brings the population along with you. And I feel that Pehac has a huge responsibility here, because if we simply endorse this report and send it on to council, first of all, we're not doing our job of helping council make a decision. That's the whole purpose was to assist council in its decision. And we're just passing the buck and leaving the whole mess. And I think, sorry, that was a loaded thing. Because I do want to say that I approached this thing not from my own I was trying to approach this not as what my own personal opinion is, because I just feel that some of the issues around the process have been raised at this meeting, and to simply endorse the report and let it go forward to council is to not address those problems and to not give council our full advice. And so what I think I suggest is that Pehac have another special meeting that would allow it to go very carefully through the report and to summarize some of the things that have been brought out today in this meeting, because it has to be captured properly. After all, that report did not tell council that there was not a consensus. It did not tell council why the working group went to the ballot system. There's lots of things that are not in that report that Pehac perhaps should get written down and try to come to a consensus itself. I don't feel that Pehac has to say, we are of one mind, take the statute down or leave it where it is. I don't think that's our role. I think it's council's role to decide on what's a way forward for our society. And if they feel they're going to make a decision on it immediately, or if they feel they need to extend it to allow some other process to take place, fair enough. But I do not feel that we can simply endorse this report and send it on to council, and that we need one more session to put our creative minds together, summarize the points, and provide more of a qualitative, kind of more of an evaluation of things to assist council. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Anybody else have comments to add here in the committee? Gina.
Yes, Gina, I'm part of the board. I'm part of the Pehac committee. And I actually, when I read the report, I actually struggle with the phrasing of it, because I underline some of the comments here. So this goes to the part in the report that says, remove the holding court statue from Picton Main Street. And then one of the things there, it says, to storage for later consideration. What does later consideration mean? There's no explanation here what it means. Other than it goes on and says, not to be relocated on public property. I see a contradiction here that I don't know how to resolve it myself here. And then it says, should Pehac support the recommendation of the working group, would encourage Pehac to suggest a more appropriate location at the next session of council. So now the decision-making falls back to Pehac, but in what framework? And again, appropriate location. What is that location supposed to look like? And further up in that same paragraph, it says, not on public land. So I don't feel that this suggestion really gives me enough information what it is that I'm actually supposed to vote on. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gina. Tracy, Peter, yes.
Yeah, I would just have to say, again, I'm trying to recognize all the difficulties you had, but I found it difficult in reconciling, okay, if we take that choice of action, what are the implications of doing that? So when you say storage or removal, is that immediate? Does it mean temporary? Does it mean permanent? I think it's unlikely that council and Pehac will want to come back to the issue once we've made a decision. So if it went into storage, one practical issue is just politically, are we going to come back to the issue? Well, maybe never. So I think we have to define what it is in each of these recommendations that you're making. So does storage mean temporary? Under what timelines is it temporary? Does it mean, in fact, permanent? The other issue is this matter of public and private land. I was on the McDonald project. It was really 5 years of my life, and we did a lot of consultation with the community. One of the things that seemed to be indicated in the report is that we did kind of an end run. You know, somehow the artwork was put up in the middle of the night by a small group of people. And in fact, this involved a lot of consultation. A lot of groups that supported the project have been silent. And I think that's kind of what happens when you get a very heated discussion. So people that once supported it have been quiet about the process. So this matter of site selection, which the Arts Council was heavily involved in, and we appreciated their help at the time in helping us select the site, we did look at a number of locations. The courthouse, next to Shire Hall, and at the library, and also at the time at the armories where it ultimately first went. And there were a whole bunch of considerations about why we chose that. That site selection process is available to the committee at some point in time. So this matter of public and private land is also has lots of implications to it. I mean, where do you put it? If it's private, does that mean we're selling it? Which I noticed came up, there were a couple of offers to purchase the thing. Or is it meant to be, by the intent of the project, on public property? And we felt at the time that certainly we couldn't get public property at that time. So we went to the armories, but the McDonald project certainly would like it on public display on public property. So I just think there's a whole bunch of things that we need to look at as questions that arose out of all these things, because there are implications to all of that. There's also the matter of the legal implications. I don't know what those are. I'm not a lawyer, but there was an agreement that was readily available on the county website. And so I think that would allow us some time to have some legal consideration of what does it mean to actually undertake that work. I think there were some discussions about actually destroying the work and melting it down into a bench. I'm not sure that that's very respectful either, particularly to the artist. And it was only an artist's letter to the working group that said, well, you really don't have that right to do this. So I do think some time for us to go through the choices and recommendations that were being made, but also what are the implications of all that, so we're clear if we choose that thing, those are the implications and sort of risk factors associated with it, but there's a clarity about what removal means, for instance. Is it temporary? Is it permanent? What is the timeline for the discussion on that? So I have a lot of questions, and I had difficulty in working through what came to us to try to do my own analysis of it. So I would support more time to come to a full understanding of what you're recommending and the risks associated with that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Brandon, you had...
Yeah, I guess to add on to Peter's thing, and you've kind of, or your comments, and you kind of expanded a bit, but again, that was a theme that came out of this whole process, was we need to have a bigger conversation. and not that's not something that Pehac needs to do. I don't think that would be appropriate. It's a greater conversation, whether that's through a consultant like Peter suggested or something along those lines. And that's, I think, something that council maybe could direct staff to look into. And maybe that's a recommendation that whatever we put forward as Pehac, we could add something that says, look, we need, in light of this recommendation, we also want to encourage council to have a greater dialogue about how we deal with these public spaces, how we have these conversations. But at the same time, I also respect the process that happened. Again, there were some flaws with it, but we were asked, as a group, we were asked by council, the CAO, to come back with a recommendation on what to do with the statue. And so I certainly support what the group did and the process they went through, and I support their recommendation of removal of it. But I would also support adding something to a recommendation of a removal that looks at recommending, either something along the lines that Peter suggested through, a greater community conversation through a process that's approved by council.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. And Liz.
Okay, I think that we have to stick to the terms of reference and the Pehac and the working group. But before I want to put a motion on the floor, but before I do that, I want to point out that I believe, and people correct me if I'm wrong, that the report is incorrect when it says that Pehac initiated this process. Can you confirm that it was Mayor Ferguson that asked Pehac to lead this?
Yes, I can confirm.
Right, so that needs to be corrected in the report. People can help me with the wording of this motion, but I would like to move that Pehac prepare a response to the working group's report to provide to council to assist it in its decision. And that, we don't need to, I don't think we need to take a long time if people agree with that motion. If we don't need to take a lot of time, because I know we've all looked at the report and we've all thought about it, but I do think we need to distill what has come out of this meeting and just put it down in a simple form so it goes forward. Because I do not think that we're in a position to endorse the report as it stands, or even with some general thing. We have to do our due diligence, and our due diligence has to do with, where is our, oh my God, whatever we are supposed to assist council. So my motion is for Pehac to, what did I say? Prepare a response or an assessment of the report to bring to council. What did I say?
Through the chair. So through my minutes that I'm taking today, which will be going to council, I've been keeping detailed notes about what everyone's been saying, because there's been a lot of great conversation by all parties here in regards to the report. So we have a special council meeting scheduled for November 17th, where this recommendation will be, the recommendation of the Heritage Advisory Committee will be going to council. Timelines are tight. We're almost close to the end of the year. We provided the report to everyone on Friday when we published the agenda. So I would just like to state that right now in regards to pushing back any other dates. In regards to a recommendation from the Heritage Advisory Committee.
Okay, Don?
Regardless of the wording of the motion, I think it would be a good idea for Pehac to meet between now and the 17th of November date of the meeting of council, so that Pehac can put forward a considered and well thought out recommendation to council for council's discussion on the 17th, and council is ultimately the group that's making the decision. So yes. I think it is incumbent upon us to give them the best of our thoughts, just as the working group provided the best of their thoughts to us.
Okay, Shirley, thanks, Shirley. Your volume's mic's off, Shirley.
Yeah, I feel a little confused because I feel that both Peter and Brendan, in essence, have also put forward a motion. So maybe, in fact, we do need a bit more discussion to see what we're really going to put forward.
So you're sorry, you think that there's two motions on the floor. Is that what you're, is that the point?
Well, I agree with both Peter and Brendan that the process may have been flawed, but they have come forward with a recommendation, but that further work needs to be done. And I think that trying to do further work with the statute still present is going to be very volatile. It'll be very difficult to do that.
Okay, thanks, Shirley. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, Thomas?
Yeah, I've been reluctant to chip in because so many people have expressed so well, what I might have said otherwise. But I do have some concerns with the process as well. I have a personal view about this, but I think the most important view of all is what's in the public interest, and the decision makers with respect to that are council and the mayor. I have some concerns about the possibility that further work might result in dueling recommendations that will not be of particular assistance to council and the mayor in coming to their decision with respect to the public interest. I think that I don't disagree that this has been a bit of a compressed process and there probably needs to be some more work done. But, to the extent we seek to be helpful in providing advice to the decision makers, I'd like to do that in a way that is not as clear as possible. Now, let me just say one further thing. I hear people, even in this meeting, discussing the history of this, and it gives truth to the state saying that the past isn't dead, it's not even past yet. I'm not sure that there's any benefit in debating what is admittedly a contested history. And this is for council and the mayor a question of the present and the future. And regardless of what other legitimate choices made with respect to this matter, and I think at this point the options on the table are, frankly, probably all legitimate, this debate is probably not going away with just this specific incident of the statute. So that's my comment with respect to.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. We have a motion on the floor, do we not? Mr. Clerk?
Could it be read out?
We don't have a move or a second.
No, but do you want to recap the motion or so?
Liz had mentioned it, but then she had mentioned rewording it potentially. Do we want to agree on a motion together? Or just make sure that, or Liz, could you restate the motion that you had?
Okay, that I move that Pehac meet again and produce its own written response to the working group report to in order to assist council in its decision. And after that's what I'm moving, and I would like to also have a chance to make the argument for it.
Okay, do we have seconded by John? Sorry.
Through the chair. So if we're going to have a written response, we would have to do that kind of together at our meeting. We couldn't independently write a response and then bring it to, we'd have to have it come to the meeting and we all agree upon it.
Okay. So we're at the stage where we have a second for the motion.
So Liz can't second the motion. Actually, you did. Yeah, that's okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Second, John. Okay, and now to a vote, right?
No, we have to have discussion.
Yes. Okay, I understand that. We're session, but next vote. Okay, go ahead. Liz, go ahead.
I just want to say that the intention of the motion is not to come up with a different recommendation or necessarily to endorse the recommendation. In fact, like, my motion is not about any recommendation about the statute. It's simply to set down, to discuss the report, the issues that have arisen through process, any things which were not in the report, which maybe should have been, like Chief Miracle's comments, all these sorts of things, simply for Pehac to properly set down its response to the process and the report. I actually don't want it. I don't want to state an opinion. I don't want to have a personal opinion about it. I want to make sure that the report, as it stands, goes to council with all of Pehac's careful and nuanced consideration of it.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments on the motion, Peter?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I've always looked at this process as an opportunity. Every community is wrestling with its history and what to do with the past. And can we really go at this in a thoughtful way that provides guidance to council and the community, and it seeks to unite us around possibilities and creative solutions rather than being so bitterly divided over this? We can expect a fair amount of national attention. This is a national story because every community is dealing with its history. McDonald's sort of a hot topic everywhere you go. So there is interest in what this community does. And I would be very pleased if, in recognizing all the different points of view and the passion that's around those points of view, all of which I recognize as legitimate, if we came out of this with a very creative, thoughtful document to say, here's what we decided to do with this piece of artwork, realizing its symbolism and all the passions and different points of views that it embraces. And in the end, all of us sitting around at this table can say, we think it's a very thoughtful, creative, compassionate, and considerate viewpoint that we all agree on, that we are proposing to council as a way forward.
Are there any other comments from members of the committee on the motion? Yes. Mr. Thomas, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, it's really more of a question. If the motion's approved, I'm taking it that would mean the Pehac would meet again and discuss this whatever report, I guess it's going to be.
That would be my understanding, Thomas. There is a special meeting that's set for council on November 17th. If we're going to meet that, then obviously we would be meeting between now and then. That's well, I'll check with the clerk.
So I've rewritten the motion, so it hasn't been carried yet. But just to address when we meet, so I'm just going to read it right now. That the Prince Edward Heritage Advisory Committee meet on November 4th, 2020 to provide a written response to the working group recommendation on the future of the holding court John A. MacDonald statute to assist with its decision, to assist council with its decision.
Okay. Are we, yes, John, go ahead.
Just one thing, we talked about what would the contents of that report be and how it happens. And Chad, you mentioned a few moments ago that you have been keeping detailed notes of today's conversation. And I think that's what Liz is getting at is that we compile Pehac's sort of expansion on, on the views into that document, which could be the document for the November 4th meeting, with possible in-meeting writing to finish it off, so it can go off to council. So that's how I could see that if we could do this.
Okay, any comments before we vote on this motion? I don't see any. So all in favor, and I ask you to make it a verbal vote, please. We go around the table so we're sure we're not trying to decipher people's appendages. Okay.
Could you just read the motion again, please?
Through the chair. So is this going to conclude the conversation we're having on this item of the agenda? Yeah. All right. So I'm going to read this one more time. That the report of the holding court John A. McDonald Statue Working Group be received, and that the Prince Edward Heritage Advisory Committee meet on November 4th, 2020 to provide a written response to the working group recommendation on the future of the holding court John A. McDonald Statue to assist council with its decision.
Okay. This motion, we have a seconder, and now can we have a vote, please? And I'll start here in the chambers.
I vote yes.
Don?
Affirmative.
In favor.
Okay. We just lost Shirley. That's it. So it's. Oh, Shirley, I'll start with you.
Yes.
Okay, and Liz?
Yes.
Thomas?
Yes.
Peter?
Yes.
Brendan?
Yes.
Okay, and that's everyone, and the motion is carried. Does that bring us to the adjournment then of the session, right? Okay, so can I have a motion to adjourn, please? Ernie, is this special meeting now?
Seconded by.
I'm just going to read it. Seconded by. The special meeting adjourned at 11:60 a.m. Okay, thank you for your contributions. We'll be in touch shortly about those things.
I don't know.
How easy it's going to be. That's why we're opposed to it.
They kicked the meeting off. Oh,